Welcome back, everyone. Paradox Interactive have had loss after loss after loss, and even worse, so many of them have been what we would call an unforced error, a problem that didn't need to happen. Cities Skylines 2, Prison Architect 2, Lamplighters League, lots of decidedly hit-or-miss DLCs across their grand strategy game lineup, life by use, multiple delays, and eventual death. It's been an unmitigated disaster for a publisher that for a long time was well respected and made niche games that people flippin' loved. It's odd then that they just held a media event in London. But it's a media event that had no video games. That's because rather than games, it was about something else. A certain sequence from South Park comes to mind. Their design director told GameFile, "I personally hate the kind of reputation we've had, at least cyclically or periodically, to release unfinished games. You know, that's got to stop." And yeah, it absolutely does, but you'd be forgiven for being less than trusting. Now today I'm covering the words of two people in interviews through multiple outlets. They are Matthias Liesche, who is the deputy CEO, and Heinrich Furreas, the chief creative officer. And first off, we gotta talk about their biggest loss. As I wrote this video, Cities Skylines 1 had more players than its sequel. That's rough, and if you add both Cities Skylines 1 and 2, you get a total concurrency number that is below what Cities Skylines 1 had years ago on Steam. It's rough, and it shows their actions damaged the very foundation of this franchise. And of all their projects, it's the Cities Skylines 2 bugs that Matthias basically hates the most because the game is core to them. And reading on through the interviews, I get a sense that Paradox and Colossal Order both agreed that it was time to release the game when they did, which does sting. Here's what he says, quote, "It was not the publisher saying to the devs, 'We don't care, kick it out the door.' We were very in agreement." Now, through the interviews, he doesn't shirk responsibility. He does own that it's on Paradox for missing things in QA and for not properly communicating the high systems requirement. Order. Paradox made the final call. So ultimately, if Colossal Order thought that was good to go, it was Paradox's job to tell them it wasn't. And the thing that was weird is the timing of Cities Skylines 2 coincided with a disastrous quarter of results. They of course had Lamplighters League, which is a big flop, and Star Trek Infinite that underperformed. And it very much felt like Cities Skylines 2 was put out to try to make that better. So the claim that Colossal Order was on board with the launch does muddy the water there. And that just leaves me thinking, I question whether the rank and file staff were as on board as this PR wave makes it seem. And I suppose I do question the judgment of both leadership teams at the time. I mean, even watching pre-release streamers would have told them that this game was not ready. What I think is becoming clear is that reality must have hit them hard. The Steam numbers show that, and they're now willing to say that that game should not have came out at that time, that it was a mistake. Now, the immediate short-term plan is to get Cities Skylines 2 to be a good, stable base for modding. That makes sense in many different ways. For a game like that, it is the modding community that keeps it alive, that basically adds features, changes things that are just so driven by the needs of the player base. Though, obviously, modding, while it is fantastic, it is also, some community labor. So if you wanted to have a high impact way of getting this game into a better state, yeah, enlisting an army of probably hundreds of hobbyist devs and the Paradox modding platform, that certainly would be the way to do it. What is interesting, though, is it's this game that has inspired what happened to Prison Architect 2 and its indefinite delay. The one thing I didn't find reading interviews was an answer to the big question, the real question, why the original developer Double 11 was removed months before the planned release of this game. We do not know. That is still a worrying thing, but clearly Henrik is trying to be reassuring here. He says that the game is not going to be cancelled. He says it's fun, that it has been fun for a while, but it's got bugs and UI issues, and that's why they've done the delay. And I suppose I have to imagine that given the successive delays and mess of other projects, they would rather just go indefinite and launch it when it's ready. Now, they unfortunately didn't give more details, but what they did say informs how we understand Paradox's decision making. This game is framed as fitting the ALICE model, and yes, ALICE is a good old acronym. It stands for Agency of Living Worlds, Inviting Cerebral and Endless Experiences. In a way, you could say that sounds like a load of wank, but think it through, and yeah, that pretty much is a classic Paradox game to a T. So they say that ALICE is their criteria, that ALICE defines what sorts of games Paradox should do, and it explains why one game was a mistake, why they went far too long on another game, and why a promising release actually looks to be the last of its kind. Let's break those three down. First, the flop. It is Harebrained Schemes' Lamplighters League that failed to meet the Alice criteria. Matthijs basically said that, yeah, it had good reviews, but it was almost immediately clear that they had to stop investing in the project. And he went on to note that turn-based tactic games were quite saturated and that they were kind of distant to the established leaders. Now, both the interviewed executives, they didn't mince their words, and as a corporate entity, Paradox certainly were pragmatic in this one. So Harebrained Schemes, the developer, actually saw deep staff cuts before the launch of the game. That means that it wasn't just the launch. Like, Paradox obviously saw the writing on the wall here, and speaking of writing, they wrote down a $30 million loss the quarter that this game launched. And what they essentially said was, this is a strong team, but it was the wrong game. And not long after slashing the team, Harebrained Schemes were actually able to negotiate their separation from Paradox. They are back to being like their own independent studio, and they've just teased their next game. It's called Graft, and I've got to admit, it looks pretty damn good, which you would expect from the people who did the Shadowrun games. But what we see here is expansion plans set in motion long ago, like the 2018 acquisition of this company. That's an acquisition that did not pan out, and you need to keep the year 2018 in mind. It will be very relevant later, and in a way, it's also relevant to the next project that came from that era. The Casualty, Life by You, a game designed to take on The Sims that was developed by Paradox Teutonic since 2019 that was delayed, and then killed. I can't say anything that will be personally revealing, but suffice to say, insiders told me that Paradox's handling of this situation certainly would not win them any allies with game developers in general, that it was a pretty damn messy situation. Now, Henrik and Matthijs both frame this game as fitting the Alice model, which it absolutely does. It's essentially a game that was meant to be like The Sims, but have a larger simulation. They essentially said, though, that it does fit Alice, but it went wrong. The quote is, "It was good strategically, but we started it in a bad way and financed it way too much before we knew enough about it," which very much is something that would speak to not enough pre-production, too much money, and then the problem is, once you put a lot of money in and you actually increase the size of production teams, then it's way harder to be agile. It's way harder to solve the sorts of problems that should be caught in the pre-production stage. So it seems to me that their plan was to take on The Sims, but in reality, that was not a plan. It was instead an ambition. And the difference between a plan and an ambition is something that many companies, myself included, completely mess up. But on this, make no mistake, it's a messy situation. Neither party sees eye to eye. Paradox in the interviews are very clear that this game was not good enough. Henrik said that it did not shine, that it was not better than The Sims 4 in any way, and he downplayed customization option work as not being gameplay, which to me makes sense if you're making Paradox grand strategy games, but obviously if you take a look at The Sims and what that player base values, well, customization options is actually humongous, and it is a part of the gameplay to those people, in the same way that Minecraft can release new types of blocks, and even though they don't do much, well, they look different. They add to the sandbox, and that works, because the audience is intrinsically motivated. Anyway, the decision to kill this game reportedly came after extensive peer review, that's within the industry, and honestly, from seeing the trailers for this game, I do see that. The trailers look rough. They do not look like something that was ready to launch into early access. But once again, that's Paradox's fault. They never should have put those trailers out. It was their job to assess the game and understand that this was not the time to do that. And once you make a game public and once you start doing trailers, that does limit what a developer can do to salvage a project, because it sets a timeline into motion. So Paradox's repeated, what I'm just going to crassly say, edging of the release date, I think that was just doomed to fail. PC Games N interview frames the delays as Paradox giving the team chances, but ultimately not seeing a pathway to release, saying they should have cancelled the game earlier. And honestly, in many cases, yeah, cutting losses earlier can really hurt, but it saves a lot of long-term pain. The thing is, though, the developers do not share this view. One of them aired frustrations on LinkedIn, and RPS actually put that developer's comments to Matthijs, who basically said that he essentially understands the developer has their point of view, that he doesn't want to get into a public fight with the developers because it won't be helpful to anyone, but he's clear. This is the quote: "I can tell you the game was not what we needed it to be. The promise that they talked about, that people got excited about, was not the game that we were looking at, and there are many different reasons, and I'm going to own up that we did not control or help them steer that in a good way. That's on us." That is a major lesson, actually, and it's something that game audiences, people who haven't really seen how the sausage is made, obviously for no fault of your own, but when you don't see that publisher relationship play out, it can be hard to understand what's going on. Very often publishers will have internal deadlines. Different departments within a publisher will not really be talking to each other properly and will be hitting different parts of a game team at the same time. All of that can derail a team's progress, and of course, if the opposite happens and a publisher only gets involved once it's maximum alarm bell time, well, that's obviously far too late. Ultimately, Paradox Tectonic was an internal studio. It seems it's one they flashed cash at but did not properly support and manage, and given the chaos we see elsewhere, I think it's obvious that even if Paradox themselves were well-meaning, their ambition stretched them to the point where they damaged just about every team they got involved with, which brings another disastrous project to mind, and that is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. It's wild, this is a game that we actually covered years back, and if you would like more coverage from us, more stories from us, I have a win-win. It's bellular.games. You see over there, when you join up, you can view loading screen, read loading screen, and you can get that as a newsletter as well. Here's our most recent edition, and the lead story's wild. It's actually about how a game costing $100 was able to top Steam, and certainly when I think, what will Sony charge people for a game that could cost $400 million? I don't know. I wonder. It's also got a bunch of things like Blizzard leaks. And what we do every day with Loading Screen is we take the news, we bring it together, put it in context, and then we keep you in the loop, and you can get that in your email inbox, where you're free from algorithms, free from ads and bullshit, and you can just read the damn content. Oh, like the old days. It's almost nostalgic. Plus, over there you get our videos ad-free and our research reports. And this channel is obviously not a solo gig. My team are goddamn incredible, and you can find more of their work on their site and support the mission that we are moving through together. Okay. Let's talk about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. Bloodlines 2 is a game with a very storied history. It was originally under another developer, and when it was under that developer, some of the core creatives from the original Bloodlines, they were there. They, of course, left. Alarm bells were raised, and, well, that team ended up leaving. And our Paradox executives frame it as the original team at Hardsuit Labs having good qualities, but struggling with project scale and staffing up, because they essentially had to do a project larger than normal and increase the size of their own team simultaneously, which is a recipe for disaster, something that has killed many's a AAA game. They apparently told Paradox as much, so it seems that both parties were aware of the issue. Now, they left the project. They're now back to doing support work, which is kind of like their older gig, so they're separate now. What's interesting then is how this game almost died after their departure. The only reason that it survived is down to one thing: how strong the work of the Chinese room, who are the new developer, is. And that's hardly a surprise. They have a very strong lineup. Most recently, they did Still Wakes the Deep. It's absolutely terrific, and I'm excited for what they do here. But as much as this appears to be a save, it's still the end of an era. And that's because it gets back to what is an Alice game, what fits this publisher. Our execs say that Bloodlines is not the sort of game that will have a super long shelf life, that it's just the way that games like that behave, where you have an influx of players in day one, there's word of mouth, a really nice high peak, but then it just trails off. Now, of course, to you and me, that may seem insane. I remember Total Biscuit absolutely championing the original game plus mods. And yes, the original Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines has a cult following, a massive amount of modding support, but financially, it's no Crusader Kings, and it's just not set up to be. And that's why Paradox say that even though they own the World of Darkness license, they say they probably will not risk making Bloodlines 3 in-house. And so, when we put the pieces together here, a story forms that they're essentially telling us the past has been abandoned. So let's talk about the new Paradox Interactive. It's a two-component formula. The first is Alice games, those sorts of games that are long-tail, sticky, and fit DLC. Component 2 is circles of competence, as they put it, where basically if a game fits the Alice framework, then the question is, how close is it to their expertise? And the example they give is Life by You. That is an Alice game, but it's one that was far from their competence. Now, another example is Mechabellum. It's a game that was published by Paradox Arc, which is their indie label. That's an Alice game, but it's outside their expertise. But of course, that's why doing it via their indie label with a controlled budget made sense. Kind of similar for Millennia, which is a 4X game. It unfortunately had a lukewarm reception, but they say that that wasn't really a problem because the game had a lower budget. Matthias basically said, the further from the core, the lower the investment should be, and that makes sense to all of us. So you might be wondering then, how the hell did all this go wrong? How did Paradox shit the bed with almost all of their major franchises? Let's talk about that. So Paradox's original CEO, Frederick Wester, left in 2018. He returned in 2021, and some people blame the 3-year tenure of Ebba, who was the CEO during that bridge period. And it did see weird things. I mean, do you remember the idea of the Paradox subscription, where you could just subscribe to Paradox and you get all their games and their DLC? It was, of course, trying to create a business solution to the problem where their DLC model does mean that if you want to buy a full Crusader Kings, there's going to be a lot of DLCs. Now, what's interesting is Henrik says that it actually started before that, and he talks about how they messed up COVID, where, look, it's the usual. They talk about culture and knowledge share being damaged by work from home, which absolutely is a risk factor that has happened in so many businesses. Now, you can do it right working from home, but that's the thing. You have to do it right, and many companies didn't. Also, them staffing up, them having a productivity decrease, and, as he put it, being caught in the spirit of the market. Which of course means line go up. So the framing is simple then, it's to cut the shit, be sensible, focus on quality, and they say that we can expect results to be very, very clear by 2026, but they say that yes, words are hollow, actions matter. And I agree with that. I agree with most of what's being said here. But here's the thing, covering all of this uncritically is dangerous. What this is, the reason why you are here, why I am here, is a game publisher event that had no games that was all about this message. So this is public relations strategy. They are saying sensible things, yes, and I am not making the claim that they're lying or that it's fake. It is them saying what we want to hear, though of course, in fairness, all that we wanted was common sense. Common sense is the thing that seems to have left the industry during COVID, so it's hardly scandalous. And so we have to balance things. This event and associated articles are a big "we're sorry" to players. It's designed to create a reset point. We all know how that South Park episode ended with Cthulhu. So in many ways, it does seem that the worst appears to be behind them and that the future will be defined by winning people back. That's the story they've tried to set for themselves. And if they succeed, that will be fantastic. I want a strong Paradox Interactive. I like the words here. But they cannot undo people's wasted time. They cannot take away senses of betrayal. They cannot undo the mistakes and the hurt caused by their mistakes. To all of those developers, that is impossible. And so we end up in an interesting position. You cannot begrudge some people wanting their pound of flesh given what's happened. That's a human response to a valid emotional debt, but it's also a debt that you cannot pay off. And so that means words are easy, change is hard, and I will assess their output as it comes, because they're right in one thing, actions matter. And you know, there's a similar company who's had a lot of problems. That company, you may have guessed it, it's Ubisoft. Check out this video next because there is an entire storyline below the Ubisoft story that drives a lot of it that loads of people are not aware of, but we put it all in one video. Check it out next.